Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 32 cheat sheet. And as you can see, obviously, live rank wise, we've suffered a lot with Foden. He did an incredible job versus what effectively was Aston Villa B, or even C, depending on how you interpret the lineup that Emery put out. Completely dominated in that game, scored great goals from very minimal chances as well. So another classic sort of FPL performance where someone pulls out a miraculous game and we've missed it. At least I've missed it, and I can tell from obviously someone who was wildcard in 26 and went out of Foden quite early, missed, for example, the performances in 26 and 27, that a little people have joined me this week, particularly as they've gone from Foden to Salah. And it's unfortunate, it is what it is, but he's a great player, and this is what happens from time to time in FPL. You just got to move on, you just got to smile, and it was a great performance as well. So that's that. Let's go on to the cheat sheet this week in a week in Game Week 32, where I think it's quite nice in terms of how you can revisualize some of the teams. So the way we want to maybe operate with our transfers with this week is that I think it's still a very good week to invest into your Wolves and Everton players, where they of course will double in Game Week 34. However, obviously with Liverpool and Arsenal, you could argue that they have slightly worse fixtures. However, depending on, let's say, how you're looking at this Arsenal defense, once again, it still looks incredible. We keep talking about how it's the best defense in the Prem, and potentially, if you're set up with an Arsenal defense, nothing really to think about. If you own Liverpool defenders, obviously, probably a good week to actually bench them if you're actually keen and bring in Liverpool players as well. Probably a week where you can maybe wait once again for Game Week 33 instead to sort of pull the trigger on that, unless you're sort of forced by price and other things. In terms of the midfield here, we don't have too many changes. We've added Johnson and McNeil to the cheat sheet. Johnson's an interesting one because I do think that there's a slight change in the guard in terms of the priority of players within the Spurs team. I think that Johnson has sort of moved into that first starting 11, by default, and I think because of that, you're going to see much more Johnson minutes going forwards, and that makes him a very, very good pick for Game Week 37, because right now we're struggling, really. We're struggling with these Spurs midfielders because players like Maddison, for example, in this period where he clearly is maybe carrying a knock or an injury of some sort, you can see that his minutes have reduced. Someone like Kulusevski no longer, permanent within the team. Timor and Richarlison sort of fighting for spots, and I'm not exactly sure what's going on with Richarlison. It seems like this knee issue is quite significant because the minutes that he's been getting are not really conducive to someone that I think would be fully fit, right? So there's probably, at least from a Spurs physio perspective, an estimation that Richarlison's not really available to play consistent and a large amount of minutes really for the Spurs team. So that's the situation right now with Spurs. We don't really need to think about these midfielders ultimately up until after Game Week 34. Game Week 35 is a nice landing spot to jump into these Spurs midfielders, and I think you can take that opportunity to do so. With McNeil, though, it's a different thing. It's a case of where you've got a Burnley at home fixture, and he is a 5.4 asset who also doubles in Game Week 34. Now, I much prefer Sarabia when it comes down to owning a player who is, on set pieces, on penalties as well, most likely even over Cunha. And that's going to be a nice little point of view, right? If you're thinking about, let's say, going for two budget midfielders, I do think McNeil could be quite a good option to go for, maybe instead of Eze, just because the short-term fixtures are a little bit better. With Eze, you can see he's dealing with the City fixture, then the Liverpool fixture. With McNeil, at least he's got this Burnley fixture where you can play him in Game Week 32, and then you have two home fixtures as well in Game Week 34. So just a little bit of a differential here. Richarlison, for the sort of reasons and the reasonings that I gave for Johnson being included in the cheat sheet, and also just what we've seen minutes wise so far, is someone that we've actually removed from the cheat sheet, or actually reduced rather in the cheat sheet. With Gross and Mbumo, unfortunately Mbumo still seems to be eased in. With Gross, it's a case of, once again, because you've got Arsenal fixtures in the distance, City fixtures in the distance, it just makes sense to bring Gross back into the team if you really want to bring Gross in later on, particularly closer to when Brighton will eventually double. Keep in mind, of course, in Game Week 34, unfortunately, someone like Garnacho is nice if he continues to have good minutes with United, which, once again, I'm holding out to see what his minutes are, depending on whether maybe Anthony could even start on Thursday. But, the landscape is such that on Game Week 34, only maybe a team like Newcastle arguably have good fixtures, right? Crystal Palace away is still a decent fixture, and then you can move on to Game Week 37. On the other hand, obviously, with a player like Gross, you have that Man City fixture, so it doesn't even make sense really to consider him at all within the short term, in my opinion. And moving on towards the cheat sheet, unfortunately, we don't have any changes within those sort of premium tiers in the midfield positions. Part of that is because I think we've already correctly assessed players like Luis Diaz, like Havertz, like Foden, like Odegaard. Foden and Odegaard have been top of the cheat sheet for a while now. And I can understand, obviously, a lot of people will be frustrated for moving on someone like Foden this week, and I think it's completely justifiable. if you look at, for example, the amount of green picks we have in the cheat sheet, these are all great players. These are all players who can actually get a lot of FPL points on the right day. And even when you see, for example, a game where Saka's benched, Odegaard arguably, is the better asset because he very well could have pen share as well. Son, for example, flattered to deceive in the West Ham game, but we know that there are plenty of great performances to come from Son. So some people who went out of Foden instead and kept some within their team, they're hurting right now. And obviously I sort of feel for them because I sort of felt that a few weeks ago. And that happens in time to time with FPL, and things can swing different ways, of course. As people maybe move more out of Sun, you can benefit from Sun's haul next week potentially as well. And that's kind of how things will go in FPL. In terms of the forward position, though, not too many changes here this week. We just have Cunha rise. Cunha is actually finally back in the team. I do think that we're going to see him start in the Game Week 32 fixture. We saw him come off the bench, which was exactly what I expected based on the Game Week 31 cheat sheet. I think you have to sort of look at Wolves' position, right? The games that are left in the Premier League are important in the sense that they obviously want to get, as high a standing as possible. But also those top spots are pretty far off of Wolves' reach. So the reality, of course, is trying to make sure that they manage the injuries that they have, the players that they have, and continue to develop the players that they do have as well. So, for example, someone like Ait-Nouri that we mentioned in the defensive position is an amazing player for them, but of course just played reduced minutes in Game Week 31. Or rather in Game Week 30, because that is just simply a fixture that Wolves probably weren't seeking to win at that point in time. And it made more sense, for example, to sort of reconsolidate with Game Week 32. This is, once again, a great run for Wolves, and I think they'll be trying to maximize as many points as possible. And someone like Cunha should get back into good minutes, given that they've sort of eased him in a little bit, because he's been in training for a while now too, and I can't see why he wouldn't start on this week. Now, with Mateta, I think the concern, once again, is the Crystal Palace offense and the lack of penalties. So for me, when you look at the underlying stats of all the players within the cheat sheet here, within the forward positions, with the exception to Højlund and Tony, who obviously have some pretty poor stats and maybe aren't rated for that reason as well within the cheat sheet, you can see that Cunha actually has pretty good underlying stats compared to Mateta. And that's part of the reason why I don't really like Mateta as well as just the Game Week 32 and 33 fixtures just not being overall too good for him. And here in the forward position, we haven't made too many changes in terms of the higher echelon players. The Haaland substitution, or rather actually the benching and basically complete rest that he got in Game Week 32 was a bit of a surprise, in Game Week 31 rather, was a bit of a surprise, but I think that just means that he's good to go for Game Week 32. Ultimately, it's not like, for example, Alvarez is within, my estimations, the sort of first string City 11. Foden obviously is, and maybe this is the type of game that makes Pep reconsider, of course, what Foden should be playing like, whether he plays more wing, more central, and that maybe can change our opinion on KDB, but I don't think that changes my estimations on Haaland. I think Haaland is still an amazing pick going forwards, and also you just have to sort of preface as well that they were quite fortunate to be fielding a very weakened Aston Villa team today. So that's part of the context, and I don't think I'm going to change, where Haaland is sitting on the cheat sheet. As far as Tony, it is a bit of a concern to see how weak this Brentford team are defensively. Part of, I think, what changes things is, whether they go for more attacking fullbacks, the type of back four, back five formation that they play with, and how that sort of has relationships with whether they become a little bit more of an offensive team or a defensive team. Clearly, of course, with Brentford, what we've seen this season is that they've struggled to get clean sheets, whereas they did so versus Brighton. So that's a little bit of a confidence booster in terms of the Brighton within the Brentford defense. But of course, on the flip side, we still continue to see week in, week out some pretty subpar performances from Tony, with exception to the Man United game, where honestly Man United were absolutely awful. And that's probably one of Brentford's best attacking performances. So to me, I'd still say that Tony has good fixtures. And you have to say that when he's got fixtures like Sheffield United in the distance, Luton in the distance as well. But I can understand a lot of people being frustrated with him and rather sort of preferring, let's say, your Isaks of the world, who's also on penalties, but ultimately plays for a much stronger offensive team. Because if there's anything that we can be critical about Newcastle, it's definitely their defense. But on the flip side, what we've seen is as well, and this sort of emerged even as a trend last year and last season, is that they have become a very, very competent offense. And even though that they have injuries like Gordon, or for example, suspensions like Gordon, rather, you can still see, and rather Almiron's injury, that you can still see that their attack is still very, very strong. And that's a positive sign, of course, if you're wanting to, let's say, invest into a forward that you'll hold out for the rest of the season going forwards. As far as the defense this week, we have a couple more changes. We've got Burn added to the cheat sheet. Part of this is because Newcastle are suffering so much defensively. We saw Hall seemingly injured. I don't know whether Eddie Howe will give us an update. Probably not. Livramento apparently is also out of the season. Pope seems to be back, maybe at the end of this month, which means that he'll probably play in Game Week 37, which is obviously not a good sign for Dubravka owners, but it's a positive sign in terms of maybe, once again, strengthening this Newcastle team, because Dubravka hasn't been perfect, to be honest. He's made a lot of key mistakes. The Bournemouth game is a good example. Even the penalty save, arguably over DCL, is a good example of that too. He just hasn't been brilliant. However, Dubravka still is very competent and still at a ridiculous price point. As far as the rest of the defense, though, you're looking at players like Paul Dume coming into the team. It is very, very weak and very, very fragile. However, Burn will still double in Game Week 37, and he does have a lot of set-piece sort of offense value, so I do like him from that point of view. But clearly, of course, this Newcastle team is weak, and we're probably waiting for maybe someone like Trippier to come into the team to help sort of solidify this back four and allow them to actually play towards the end of the season with a pretty competent lineup. But right now, it's not looking like it's possible for Newcastle. So I can understand why people would completely ignore Dan Burn. I think it's perfectly fine to do so. But just keep in mind that, of course, he will be an option later down the line for Game Week 37. As far as other changes, we've heard news that Gusto has been training, actually. So, contrary to our belief before the previous cheat sheet, it seems like Gusto might be fine for Game Week 32. I don't know whether he's fit for Game Week 31 because he did suffer a cramp, and I would say that the United fixture is technically more important. But then if you also look at Chelsea's season, it's not like that every single game is that important for them. I think right now it's a case of just continuing to develop their players. If Malo Gusto, for example, is suffering from a potential cramp and he needs rest, I mean, it makes sense that he might be rested versus United and he could play in Game Week 32 versus Sheffield United. But I think the landscape is such that Gusto is still a very good pick going forwards. He still looks like a very key offensive player for the Chelsea team. And despite the defense being poor, conceding obviously to a 10-man Burnley, I still think he's a very good pick. As far as Bradley, it feels like Trent is very, very close to coming back, so I am genuinely worried about his minutes. Another thing to mention, of course, is that Tsimikas has been playing. He will be part of the squad at times. Robertson is also back in training, and Joe Gomez, over the course of the season, has deputized really well in both the left back and right back positions. And because, of course, the center back position is very entrenched, I do think Bradley's going to lose minutes soon. So as a short-term punt, I think he's done incredibly for managers because last week, not many people got clean sheets. He still got bonus points. This week, you could still see him do extremely well versus Sheffield United. And he might even get the Crystal Palace game, depending on where, Trent starts to get his minutes back and sort of gets a rub of the green. So we'll see what happens there. But I think Bradley, I'll still keep him as a yellow pick for now, but I think we can drop him. Players like Branthwaite, Ait Nuri Munoz, I think are just fantastic for Game Week 34 and the double there. So they're excellent. And of course, some people can consider Mikolenko and Tarkowski. Tarkowski's probably actually a better set piece threat than Branthwaite. And the underlying stats do agree with that. With Mikolenko too, you're also just looking at a player who very often actually does get into good positions, especially shooting positions as a fullback. So as a differential, I also quite like him, but I'm not going to add him to the cheat sheet just for brevity reasons. As far as Van Heck, Zabarnyi, just players within the distance. Zabarnyi obviously did well for this week once again. As a Senesi owner and someone who didn't really have the opportunity to move to Zabarnyi, I continue to be very jealous of Zabarnyi owners, but congratulations to the points there. Other positions and other changes, of course, would include, let's say, a Man City defense sort of update. Ultimately, the next three fixtures are quite good, and we also have sort of overcome a period of pretty bad fixtures for United, or City rather. And of course, with players like Guardiola getting more minutes, Akanji getting more minutes because of the injuries in the squad, and also maybe priorities within the Champions League, I do think that you can quite easily invest into Man City defense, particularly on the back of a wild card. As far as other moves and other changes, we got Udogie and Porro falling. I do think we're reaching a point in the season where we can say that the Spurs defense is very, very poor. And ultimately, even though the attackers are good, the attacking fullbacks are good. For example, you can see that Udogie and Porro both cracked, good sort of high XG value shots within the game versus West Ham, that their defense is absolutely tatters. And you probably still don't really want to be invested into these players up until basically Game Week 37. So for me, I think they do fall in the cheat sheet in terms of the short-term priority of them, the value of them in the short term. So they do deserve to fall. Maybe you can actually make the same argument for Newcastle players, but I still feel like that Newcastle do try at least to get clean sheets intuitively. And yes, even though actually a team like Spurs have actually recovered a little bit with Van de Ven coming back, it is overall concerning, I think, just to say that they have a blank as well in Game Week 34. So that for me is the small needle mover between, let's say, how I'm rating Newcastle assets versus Spurs picks right now, because I still think that they're both pretty poor defenses, obviously, in contrast to how good they are as offenses. And then the last change, of course, is Trippier dropping. We seemingly got some news from journalists that Trippier is actually 2 to 3 weeks out still, which obviously is a huge point of concern in terms of managers who've actually invested into Trippier recently. I think what would make sense to do is probably to go out of Trippier and then just reinvest the funds, because you don't really want to be holding up your team with a player who at 6.7 million could very well be some other very, very good defenders at cheaper prices, which would also allow for upgrades within the forward and midfield positions for you. So that's the only change there. And going forwards, of course, as I said, Everton defense is probably one to look at, even Ait Nouri as well, in combination to that, just because he's such an attacking player. And that's obviously something that we noticed recently because of the injuries, but also, Ait Nouri ultimately was always the best pick that we liked in terms of Wolves defense, even going back to Wildcard 26 and things like that. As far as the goalkeepers this week, and just to round things off, we have basically no changes. I think what I've done is taken Leno out of the cheat sheet. I just don't think he's got any value for any players for the rest of the season. All the other goalkeepers here will actually double game week, with exception to Kelleher. So the only thing I'll say with Kelleher is that Alisson seems to be coming back into team training next week. This is what Jurgen Klopp confirmed to us. And of course, what that means is that by game week 34, I do think that Kelleher is going to lose his spot in the team. So that's not very good for people who have to make that move maybe back into Alisson, or who recently have invested into Kelleher but don't have the money to go back into Alisson. So that's something to think about. Although I think you've already gotten enough value out of Kelleher. Ultimately, you got a clean sheet versus Nottingham Forest. You might get a clean sheet once again versus Sheffield United. So I think it was still a very good transfer, and he's still a green pick for now, up until basically Alisson's confirmed to be back in the team. So that will be the only subjective change, I think, that you'll probably see within the cheat sheet in the future. Otherwise, of course, you're looking at your double game week goalkeepers here. And of course, we have, a huge preference towards someone like Raya, who does play for the best offense or the best defense within the league. As far as Pickford, of course, and even Petrovic and Kelleher, of course, these are still the sort of top half goalkeepers who have doubles. Whereas in contrast to, let's say, maybe Henderson, of course, the only thing I'd say about Henderson is that I still don't have that much confidence really with Crystal Palace as a genuine pick, and also to invest into, because in the short term, you've got, once again, City, Liverpool fixtures, and then you just have the double. But it's like, you really must be thinking that you're getting a lot of value from Henderson. And in the context that, let's say we have Chris Richards, who could be back by game week 34, or Daniel Munoz, who at least provides some attacking value, I quite like Henderson over, for example, or I quite like the actual defenders within Crystal Palace over Henderson. Whereas with Raya, at least you're saying you're getting a sort of bit of a cost benefit and guarantee of play, right? Because outside of Kiwior, who I don't think is nailed, and we got this confirmation once again with the Luton rotation, that, yeah, Saliba, your Gabriels, your Boyds of the world are much more expensive. With Pickford, I still think that he makes a lot of saves for a team with that many sort of expected goals conceded. So it's a nice position to be in, right? You have a high saves per 90s goalkeeper, and also you're playing for a competent defense. Same with Petrovic as well. And that's pretty much where we're going to round out with the cheat sheet this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bit of a short one, because I think our transfers aren't going to be that deep, that serious. We're probably all going to be sort of in a holding pattern for Gaming 34 and sort of making small incremental moves, because we've made that sort of big template shift towards Salah, no matter where you've landed within the Foden sweepstakes. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.